to one that we did.
Recorded by the host or a participant.
One that we did on a past homework. And would you have an issue if it's similar to what we put before? Because I know you use Turnitin and it shows you like what was, yeah.
So I mean, so that's not unintentional that the questions are often related, if normally not perfectly the same. So you're certainly welcome, to use a reading response material as a kind of basis, as a kind of working, you know, when you write like a first draft, I don't want to use foul language, you get a bunch of stuff down on paper, and somewhere in there, let me put it this way. So the answer is basically yes, but obviously you want to refine it from what, because you want to specify it to the specific question being asked, and you want to put it in there in terms of being in the flow and the logical order of you know, the essay on the exam and the questions and so on. Post the PP for today in BB. What's the PP?
The PowerPoint. You didn't post no.
Oh, it's not there.
No, so for today's class, it's not there.
Okay, I mean, I only have one PowerPoint for all of 1984.
Oh, okay, I see.
So I just use sections of it at a time. Although it might be the case that some of the things I present you today are there. I can repost it because I over each semester I kind of modify them and tweak them, and they change a little bit from what's on Blackboard, and I need to update that. So you know, like when you write, you put stuff down, and there's a great line about Michelangelo sculpting, and he has the big block of marble, and he says all sculpting is doing is, you know, removing everything that's not the figure from the marble. Like he's making the image of Jesus or Mary or some such. So all that sculpture is removing the material of the stone that's not the figure itself. Obviously that sounds like he makes it sound very easy. Of course it's very hard. But writing's the same way. Just like a painting, the first draft is just a bunch of stuff you have down. And then what you want to do is remove everything that's not really the final polished answer. So yeah, that's a long way of saying that starting with those reading responses is just fine.
Okay, yeah, because I didn't want it to be like my answer to be so similar to that, and then you see it, and then you're like, there's like an issue with it.
I got it. It's still your work.
Right. Okay.
And if I really wanted to differentiate, I would make sure that the questions were like entirely different. So I mean, that's to be expected. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, good. So there's three really.
I do have a question, Professor.
Please do, Luis.
So the day of the week that we had the break, I didn't find no work that was due for that week. Or I was not looking properly. Which one of those?
If you look in the folder and you follow the dates, the due dates, which are clearly indicated, that should answer the question.
I will look at it. If I have any trouble, then I'll wait until the end of class. Okay.
All right, there's three big things we want to look at today. Last class, we got a kind of lay of the land with 1984, a little discussion of, you know, the concept of a dystopia, the concept of a totalitarian regime. And those are kind of general concepts. And then we started looking a little bit about how this specific world of 1984 reflects some of those basic ideas, right? Today, since this class is really about human relationships and this kind of push and pull, right? You know, that Dr. Dolittle, there's this animal called the push me pull you. It's got like a head at both ends, and like it pushes the one and pulls the other. And that's kind of human relationships involve this this binary of harmony and conflict. And I think I've said it many times now in the class, but conflict and competition and the like, I actually consider a social phenomena rather than like an antisocial phenomena, because conflict always involves what? It always involves other people, right? I mean, if you weren't in conflict, I mean, in theory, and you weren't, I mean, you could not be engaged with people at all. You could be isolated. So we really want to drill down on the way in which this totalitarian, one of the things we said about the totalitarian regime is that the political structure, the public structure, which always seems so different from our personal lives, our private lives, and our psychological lives, right? And our personal intimate relations, because we in our society have a distinction between private and public. Well, here we're looking at a society where that distinction simply does not exist whatsoever. And at any moment, at any time, especially because there are no fixed laws, law is arbitrary. It's really the antithesis of law. We have something called the rule of law. This regime is able to reach down into people's minds and try to fashion them and their relationships in a certain way. And as we've seen, it's some version of divide and conquer, through the perpetuation and promotion of hate that habituates the emotion of hate in people. And also this concept of the panopticon, where they're constantly aware of being surveilled. And by constantly being aware of surveillance, there's this principle called panopticonism, which is that you start to internalize your own surveillance and you start to regulate yourself, right? It's the policeman that's no longer out there. I think in the 60s, they called it the policeman is now inhabiting your mind and regulating you're doing it to yourself. I mean, isn't that the ultimate form of control, where the system or the man, as they talked about in the 1960s, which now seems like the dinosaur age for you guys, your generation, a lot of you. What better efficiency and economy in a totalitarian regime to get everybody to control themselves, right? That it would think about all the resources that they don't have to expend. So they want to kind of psychologically break these people down in their relationship, not just with each other, but with themselves. And what we want to focus on today more specifically, and we touched on all these things last class, but we want to look at the passages in the text and really kind of mull them over. So Winston works at the Ministry of Truth. And one of the things we discover is that the relationship with history becomes utterly central to actually controlling these people. We think history is something simply in the past, and therefore it's been superseded and made obsolete by the present and our anticipations of the future. History for us, in a lot of ways, as modern Americans, is like that data sitting on your phone or sitting on your computer that's just cluttering things up, and you want to like dump it out in the wastebasket because it gets in the way of the present reality. Well, Orwell really flips that kind of bias or prejudice on its head, and he helps to illustrate why our history is so fundamental. And he illustrates it on two levels. One, on the collective level, which is to say all of these people, including Winston, as like subjects or citizens of this strange world of 1984. But then on the other hand, and in that history, we're talking about the history of the regime, the political history or the social history. But then there's also an issue with history in terms of Winston's own personal history. And in both cases, whether he's contemplating the history of his own society or whether he's contemplating the history of his own life as an individual, there are things that are fundamentally opaque to him. There are things that he doesn't know. There are things that seem to be very strategically withheld from him by the regime itself, right? And why does the history matter so much? I think the point is Okay, Destiny, I'll take a look. The point is that our history is intimately connected with our identity. This is really crucial. If we don't know our history, we can't possibly understand who we are, whether we're talking about as a people or whether we're talking about it as an individual. The future is a big black hole. It doesn't exist yet. I mean, it's likely to happen, but it's not there yet. The present is just one little blip. And the way we understand the present, yes, is in some extent based on how we anticipate what's going to happen in the future, because as being, animals that are trying to live, kind of Darwinian, we have to anticipate the future and foresee things. But, our understanding of the present is really, for the most part, I think you could make an argument anyway, it's based on our past, because that's the thing that's actually happened. That's the thing we've actually experienced. That's the thing we actually know, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And I think the basic, to clarify it, the basic logic of this society is to strip people of their history so that they can't have a grasp of who or what they really are. And by not really being clear about who or what they are, they can more easily be shaped by the powers that be. So there is the famous line in this text that we'll come to, in which the party's slogan is this. I think I have it, pardon me if I can find it somewhere where I have it. Yeah, here we go. So these are just some key elements of this society that control and shape the psychological life of the people and their relationship with themselves and their relationships with each other. He who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Okay. What does Winston actually do at the Ministry of Truth? What's his job?
Can I change what is being said?
Close. Yeah, I mean, change what's being said in what?
As I means,
What does he do? Without getting too deep into the meaning or implications of it, just what does he do at the Ministry of Truth?
He delete all the information that we can have to the party.
Yeah, he deletes and changes information. What does he, let's be very specific. What does he change information in?
the truth.
He is going to change up to a point, the truth, but it gets complicated, and we'll come back to that. What exactly does he do at the Ministry of Truth? It's not complicated. He deals with the same kind of media that we do, just in, it's still out there today. It's just not the dominant one. What does he do? I mean, you're all on the right track, and everything you've said is perfectly true, but I want to get a concrete understanding of what he actually does on a daily basis.
He edits the news.
Yes, exactly. He doesn't do online editing like they would do today or what have you, social media propaganda. I mean, we have a minister of disinformation now from the Biden regime. You don't understand. That is literally the Ministry of Truth. And many things that this lady has promoted prior to her rise to, I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically the Ministry of Disinformation. You can look it up. I'll post something about it. She said a number of things that are actually completely false about really major news stories in the past 3 or 4 years, 3 or 4 or 5 years. And I mean, first of all, the Ministry of Truth is the Ministry of Propaganda, right? It's not truth at all. right? Later in book 3, it's what the party says is the truth. Let me ask a question here. This gets into a question about how we understand what truth is. What is the truth based on? What is the foundation for the truth? In contrast to a lie or fiction? What makes something true rather than false? What makes a statement true rather than false? Yeah, facts to support it. Where do those facts come from?
Possibly like media, the facts could come from, but I was gonna say maybe the truth means how many people will gather together and join on the same idea, even if it's not actually true.
Okay, so I mean, here's the problem. You've just created two very different meanings of the word truth, which is what we're getting. What you've talked about is exactly what we're getting at. What is, and maybe not everybody agrees. What is the truth based on? So facts, research of what? Where are the facts that can count as the truth? Is the truth just what people say it is? Oh boy.
I was gonna say facts when I was saying just
Yeah, what kind of facts?
I was gonna say like maybe historical or something in like history when people go back. I don't know.
What is history based on?
Oral tradition.
So more words.
Yes.
I mean, I don't totally disagree with you, and because there's some complications with history as truth, right? Because, but what kind of things do historians deal with? They deal with primary source things, right? They deal with hard facts at some level, like here's a painting from the Renaissance, or here's a building, or here's a document from that date. The document might express opinions that aren't necessarily true, but the document is real, and the document came from that period, and it expresses something true about that period, even if we don't agree with the words that are, I mean, it's almost immaterial exactly what they said. The fact is that is what they said, right? I mean, so we've got two models at truth at work here of truth. You know, one being that truth is a representation of reality, and that our words, when we speak the truth, our words are reflecting some physical, concrete reality that simply is or was the case. You know, Christopher Columbus sailed in the year 1492, or he didn't, right? The other model is, you could say, truth by consensus, right? And of course, we often blur these two distinctions because, of course, different people will present different facts, and then you go, well, this person says this is true based on these facts, and this person will say things based on these facts, or they'll take the same facts and they'll have two different interpretations of them, right? So there's a lot of challenges here, but in this world of 1984, the truth is literally what the party says it is. And this becomes palpably clear what the implications of what that means when we get to the Ministry of Love in book 3 with Winston and O'Brien. And I'll just give an example, right? You know, when, you know, he is brainwashing him and torturing him to capitulate to the truth that the party wants him to believe. And he, you know, he gets drugged and he gets electroshock and all this kind of horrific torture. It's like CIA. He's like in a CIA black site almost, except they call it the Ministry of Love, right? It's a great name. So there are scenes where, O'Brien, when he's torturing him and trying to brainwash him, he holds up what we would think of as 4 fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4. And O'Brien goes, how many fingers am I holding up? And Winston goes, well, it's 4. And what does he get? He gets a shock from him, because how many is he really holding up? He's holding up 5, right? And so why is it 5 instead of 4? Because that's what the representative of the party says it is, right? So he changes the past by changing the newspapers. And basically what he does is like, today they would just edit a website, right? But he literally cuts and pastes from the previous day's newspapers and revises the past papers to reflect the positions of the party and where the party wants to see this history go in the present. So you can see how who controls the past controls the future. If you can change the past, you can start to shape how people act going forward into the future. Alia.
I definitely do see the relation to like their society and our current society, because it seems like sometimes, sometimes what we're taught in history classes, like, even though it might have been true a lot about the African culture and how slavery existed, it kind of puts us in a mind state, especially like some people who are Hispanic and Black, that we're still oppressed because we're learning about when we were oppressed, and everybody else is learning about it too. Like, I always asked, I said, what would it feel like to be a European person who's learning about how I used to be the race group that would oppress Black people? Like, would it make me feel superior, or would it make me feel bad? Like,
Sure. So let's make 2 points. There's a more general point to be made, that any collective of people, like a nation or a religious group or what have you, has this issue of their relationship with their own past. And obviously every generation has a slightly different relationship with their own past. And it shifts, there's shift of emphasis, new facts are discovered. So everybody, to some degree or another, is in a process of evolution in their relationship with their past, because their past isn't, despite the fact that it happened one way rather than another, our understanding and knowledge of it is a little more flexible, even if we're really just seeking the truth. There's still a bit of slippage there. So this is a feature of all societies. But we could say that the world of 1984, and even our own, which I can say more about in a second, I mean, these are societies where there's this radical destabilization of what really happened. And let's be clear, with 1984, there is a total fabrication of the past simply to suit the needs of the party for the present and the future, right? The United States is undergoing, I mean, I don't know where you want to mark it. You could mark it since the 60s, or you could mark it even in the last 30 years. There's been a new kind of intensification with our understanding in our relationship with slavery. But, the emphasis that's put on slavery, especially the way it manifests, the way you've talked about, that minorities, brown people, people of color, African Americans, former slaves, however they're described, and all those different names have slightly different shades of emphasis. I mean, one of the logics seemed to be that nobody is really, technically slavery is over, but nobody's actually liberated themselves from the condition of slavery, and it still exists, just in more subtle, nuanced forms. Now, the interesting thing is, whether that's true or not, it's a very different way of thinking about America's history. I mean, there's been our challenging relationship with slavery goes back to the colonial period and the founding period. One of the more disturbing things about this whole, the 1619 project, I mean, the notion that we were founded not in 1776, but in 1619. On one hand, it calls to mind things that not everybody wants to talk about. So one thing it does is instigate a difficult conversation to be had. And that's a good thing. On the other hand, there's something very strange about saying that America, the United States of America, was founded in 1619. The first problem is in 1619, we were a bunch of British colonies. Last time I checked, the whole purpose of the Declaration of Independence was, number one, to liberate ourselves from Britain, full stop. And number two, in the process of liberating ourselves, actually assert certain basic human rights that we as Americans subscribe to, that in fact the British did not subscribe to, period. I mean, Great Britain did not believe that there were these things, God-given rights that were endowed on us by nature, our nature or our creator. Their rights came from the political structure, right? Thomas Jefferson, whatever personal problems he had as a human being with slavery and Sally Hemings and so on, I mean, he said that government was not there to give us or take us away our rights, or for us to very simply be there at its disposal. He said government is there to protect our rights and no more. This is one of the most radical ideas in human history, where however imperfect, because obviously United States has not fully lived up to its promissory note, as Martin Luther King put it, Martin Luther King Jr., as my daughter always reminds me, because I always forget the junior. But the point is, we're the only country on the planet that's founded with that conception of government, that it's there to protect our rights, which is to say our freedoms. Okay. One of the interesting things that's lost in the discussion, the 1619 discussion, is, well, I mean, we became a country in 1776, repudiating an institution that had been brought here by England, English government, quite literally. And if you look at the founders' actual discussion of race and slavery, I can tell you that a substantial amount of it is being left out of our discussion that we're having. Most of the founders of this country, even when they had slaves, and I know we can talk about the personal contradiction of it, but even when they had slaves, virtually all of them to a man, they were all men, they were all white men, all of them to a man hoped for and expected the abolition of slavery. And they also knew that it was going to be the great dividing problem because of the economic and the social cultural realities that slavery had manifest as it developed in Southern culture. And actually slavery intensified in the lead up to the Civil War for various economic and also social reasons that were developing in the South, and particularly the Deep South, when the Deep South became a more powerful political force by the 1820s and 30s. So we really show our nation this relationship in a very dramatic way. And it's something about the certain moment we have in our history where we're really addressing these things. You see it manifest in the removal of all the statues, right? This world of 1984 literally goes around the regime eliminating things from the past. Now, whether we like a Confederate soldier or general or someone who was a slaveholder, may not be the point. What kind of world do you live in when the very things that could serve as repositories of history are being erased, right? One person could argue that Confederate general standing there perpetuates negative elements of our history. The other person could argue that by having it there, it's a reminder of what actually did happen in this country. And you wouldn't want to forget those horrible things, because discussion, having that thing there to discuss those things, when it's not there, who's having the discussion? There's some interesting complications there. One of the biggest things, the absolute biggest thing, is the way in which, I'm going to be provocative here now, the way in which the Democratic Party tries to eliminate its history of racism, slavery, so on and so forth. And that trying to rewrite history and like almost flip it on its head, like the parties were reversed during the Civil War somehow, it is one of the most fascinating attempts at like this kind of he who controls the past controls the future, trying to literally revise who was what historically. And racism being an instrumental part of the Democratic Party, party platform element, I mean, that really lasted deep into the 20th century, And it may have not completely disappeared either, depending on how you want to look at the policies they want to advance on behalf of so-called minorities. You can wonder if all the policies that they want to advance are really there to bootstrap and liberate people in the way that is claimed. Okay, couple other things here. So 819. Okay, so our relationship with our past, both political and public and personal and private. Then this issue of newspeak, right? How we frame our understanding of the world is in words, right? We talked about with Sapiens, the way in which human language allows us to create all these concepts. And really, because of those concepts, understand things about the world and grasp certain meanings that we cannot have without the complexity of language and its special ability, particularly this creative function of language, to discuss things that have no tangible reality, right? So it's our language that allows us to think in the way that we do. And if our language is changed, it's almost impossible to think in a way that's not also affected by those changes. And then the last one, we want to look at the interpersonal relationships between the characters as manifest in the discussion of sex and its role in the regime. We just read Plato's Symposium, which is this ode to Eros and has some, allusions to sex and being a product of desire, Eros, being a product of this intense passion, this intense feeling of attraction for a thing, almost a kind of obsession, right? We see that in the, well, let me ask all you, and then we'll start turning to read a little bit. What is the role of sex in the world of 1984, and what kind of relationship or what kind of feelings are cultivated by the system here, by the society? Relate feelings between man and woman, for example. The two key relationships, male-female relationships that we see depicted are first Winston and his former wife, who he's no longer with, and then Winston and Julia. And they're almost like, they're like yin yang to each other. They're almost exact opposites. What, does anyone remember anything like what his relationship with his wife was like? Alia.
I don't remember what I don't know if I was misreading or maybe mixing up books, but I thought that his wife had died.
I don't think she's dead, but she's not in his life anymore.
Oh.
I mean, she died in a certain way psychologically.
Oh.
Well, in any case, he reminisces about his relationship with his wife. Anyone pick up how he discusses his relationship with his wife? And it gets to this issue of the function of sex in this world. Okay, yeah, we'll look at it then. That's fine. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn to the text Kindle. I've got all this stuff on my screen. Oh. And it's about that time. Okay. So in a moment, I'll ask someone to read here. I talked about like our relationship with history. You know, did Columbus really sail in 1492? Or what was the truth of it all? What was the real meaning behind it? In this world, you don't even know whether Columbus sailed in 1492 because you don't even know the year you're living in. Imagine how psychologically destabilizing and disorienting it is. I mean, if you don't know the moment you're actually living in, how can you possibly feel confident about any information you get about the past? And one of the fascinating things is, so someone said that when he works at the Ministry of Truth, which is really the propaganda ministry, that he takes the truths that are in the newspaper and he changes them to propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, to whatever the regime needs at the moment to promote whatever agenda they have at the moment. It sounds like the media we have today. They just, honestly, some of the things I've heard them say, wickedly, factually incorrect about the most fundamental issues of our time, really. And they have no problem lying about it simply to suit their narrative. But one thing that's funny about him changing what's in the newspaper is he acknowledges at one point that he no longer is aware of when he's changing a truth to a falsehood, because in many cases, he, say a week before, he took the same paper and changed it then, and now a week later, he's being asked to change the change he made. So in many cases, he's not changing the truth. He's actually changing previous falsehoods that now need to be updated, right? You see how this whole relationship with the past, it never stops. It's a constantly evolving thing. Okay, so what's really funny when he says, since about that time, well, this whole issue of time is very unclear. What time are we actually talking about? Their whole sense of time in this world is kind of destabilized because they don't have the external markers to really mark time in a clear and definitive way. And you can just imagine how unsettling that is. So here he's going to talk about war. And you see that war in this book, it features very prominently. There is an external war going on with other nations. There's also a war going on between the citizens. They hate each other. They are cultivated these negative emotions. And the negative emotions on the social level are connected with the negative emotions on the public level. There's a war within the individual of each person because they're in conflict. I mean, I think everybody wants to live in harmony with themselves. They want to know the truth about their own life as they see it. And this is a world that doesn't allow you to have that straightforward understanding. You don't have the private realm to have your own truth, right? A couple other things. War. Why is war good? Because it's simply a condition that cultivates this kind of military spirit, this kind of anger. And you can see that one thing that the society is constantly determined to do is, instead of cultivating eros as love as the dominant emotion, harmony, comradeship, fraternity with your fellow human being, it cultivates a conflictual mentality, and constantly seeing these images of war is really part, it's just like kids playing violent video games and getting, all worked up or something like that. It has its psychological effect when it's kind of beaten into you for a long period of time. Look at what they did to us, with COVID. I mean, COVID was a serious situation on one hand, but on the other hand, there was this whole propaganda campaign to scare the living bejesus out of everybody. I mean, it was already difficult enough for a whole variety of reasons. People lost loved ones and on and on. People couldn't go to funerals of their loved ones. People couldn't get married because of COVID. I mean, all kinds of really horrendous stuff. I couldn't imagine losing someone and like not being able to have a funeral because of COVID. I mean, it's pretty twisted. But the amount of I don't know, it was often described as like fear porn, right? Just keeping people in a constant state of fear. To me, there was a basic justifiable level of fear about COVID. There's no doubt about it. It's like this unknown disease. What the hell is it? But then there was this additional, in my way of looking at it, there was an additional layer that the media and everybody layered on it to really kind of terrorize people. And it's had an effect. I mean, that would happen for, it's May of 2022. It's 2 years and 2 months after the beginning of all this stuff, the kind of real dramatic beginning. Then one other thing interesting about war is that whenever a country goes to war, the war effort and everything that comes with it means like typically in the United States, this is definitely true. You guys, I mean, if you're 20 years old, you've never lived in the United States without a military conflict until, I guess, Biden, chaotically brought the troops home from Afghanistan, right? 20 years we fought a war. I don't think any of you could explain to me what we actually won after 20 years in that war and what the purpose of it really was. I mean, there's superficial explanations, but they don't seem to bear out when you look at what actually happened during those 20 years. It's hard to explain what good came of it. The Iraq War lasted for a very long time too. So during wars, governments get more powerful because they need to consolidate power, and very often they restrict freedoms, right? If you look at the history of World War I and World War II, there were pretty severe restrictions put on speech. There was rationing. There was a massive expansion of government. Government gets more powerful, right? And they, spend money on military and things like that. So when countries are on a war footing, it's almost inevitable that governments get more power and certain freedoms are set to the side, even in democracies, even in free countries, that's a regular phenomenon. So this state of war helps to, encourage their perpetual enslavement. Let's be clear. These people, they don't look like the slaves of the South before 1860. But in a sense, they are in a much more insidious way because they don't live free lives, and anything they do and say can be taken from them, used against them. I mean, they really don't have ownership of themselves. They don't have ownership of anything. If there are no laws, things can be taken from you at any time, whether it's your life or your thoughts or your whatever it is. Okay. So this explains, I think, some reasons why war is so important. And especially it sets the kind of psychological tone of this war. Remember, he lives in the victory mansions, and then he smokes victory cigarettes. It's all a reflection of this martial spirit, this military mentality. The nation, instead of directing their attention toward their private life and their loved ones, your family members during Eid, right? It's all their eros is directed and channeled toward hatred and toward a desire for military conflict. And one thing, so they have this 2 minutes. What's the 2 minutes of hate? Like they see on the screen the enemies of the state and they go, I hate them and I want to rip their face off or something. Like they're really like frothing and chomping at the bit. You get the impression of a group of people who, instead of having like a romantic outlet or playing sports to get their yayas out or even having sex, that all their kind of vital energies, including their eros, their, the kind of like sexual or intense love energy is directed toward hate. And that's a conscious way that the regime has of controlling the society. It's pretty gross, actually. And you see a lot of it in our society. Our media is just left and right. It's gratuitous at constantly creating a boogeyman on each side. There's always a boogeyman to hate, right? And they get people, you watch the political news, oh my goodness, people get so frothed up. They're like, they're foaming at the mouth. It's crazy. Okay, who would like to read for us starting here? And we're gonna start to get a little look at the history of this situation. Who could read for us? Ashley, you think you could read a little bit for us?
Sure. Am I reading for since?
Yeah, since about that time.
Okay, since about that time, war had been literally continuous. Through strictly speaking, it had not been always the same war. For several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself, some of which he remembered vividly. But to trace out the history of the whole period, to say who was fighting whom at any next page, or
It's at the bottom there. It's there. Any given moment.
any given moment, I can see it. I don't know why.
Can you scroll a little bit?
Let me try to make it. At any given moment would have been utterly impossible since, and that's all I have. Okay. Where'd it go? I'm sorry, I'm looking for it. No written record and no spoken word ever made mention of any other alignment that the existing one. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was in 1984, Oceania was at war with
Eurasia
and in alliance with Eastasia. In no public or private utterance was it ever admitted that the three powers had at any time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with Eastasia and in alliance with Eurasia.
Okay, so he's talking about how in the present moment, the understanding of the alignments and who's against who in the war is one way, and nobody will ever acknowledge that only a few years before the alignments were different. It's like that never happened. And I'll give you one funny connection to our current situation. There used to be a huge contingent of people politically in this country who were anti-war. Like any war was a bad war. Doesn't matter what president, left, right, Democrat, Republican got into it. War was bad. War was really bad. And any war was bad. And many of those same people who have been kind of anti-war for probably 20, 30 years, like maybe the entire time I've been following the news, all of a sudden with this Ukraine war, they've come out that war is like the most glorious thing and must be fought to the death. and they're totally supportive of it. And it's like their previous position of being against any kind of war, like totally vanished. And I tell you, if you follow politics, this happens all the time where people, well, I'll give you another example, Joe Biden. He's now, because of the Roe v. Wade leak, if you followed any of that at the Supreme Court, he's become fervently pro-abortion. But the funny thing is, it was only a little over a decade ago that he was actually not so sympathetic to abortion. So I'm not pointing out which view is right or which one you like better. I'm only pointing out that he's basically completely contradicted himself in his current position from one not that long ago. And he kind of pretends like the previous position never existed at all. And it happens in politics all the time. It's like there's a little, does anyone remember, everybody see the movie Men in Black?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, they have that little pen that flashes the light in the eyes and people don't remember anything.
Yep. The memory.
Yeah.
Memory.
So that's the memory. It's a version of the memory hole, really. You know, the memory hole is where facts get thrown down this hole, literally to be sucked up and thrown out in the trash. So politicians all the time, like, will have one position and then they'll change it. But it's not just that they change it. It's that they pretend that the previous position they never had ever. And they like flash that little thing in your eyes and like make you pretend like it never happened. For example, the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton, they were not pro-gay marriage in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was in office. And they kind of actually reinvented them. They relatively were reasonably socially conservative. And then they reinvented themselves as fervent, same-sex marriage, blah, blah, blah. It's not about whether you agree or disagree with the position. I'm just pointing out the way in which politicians and our media will literally just change their story and kind of like wave the magic wand in your face. And they really want you to pretend like they didn't say that thing in the past and that you can't like compare the two, one with the other. Alia, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to say that they made a mistake. I feel like Joe Biden, when he was saying that he wasn't pro-abortion, he just kind of came to his senses. And I feel that was kind of cool that you are allowed to change your opinion in the public eye and act like it never happened because.
Well, so I mean, you've gotten a very good point here, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but obviously times change and politicians have to change with the times. So obviously, politicians evolve. Every politician evolves. Human beings evolve. The more facts they get, they reconsider their position. But I'm describing something a little more narrow than that, because obviously politicians are free to change their position. You can't hold everything in the past they said against them. The point is that I want to make is a specific one, and that's that very often, but not always, that they want to kind of, like I said, wave a magic wand, and they really don't want you to believe that they ever had an alternative view. Especially if they're going to castigate the person who has the alternative view now. Like, let's say there's a person who's still against gay marriage or something like that. If there is such a person who really has a dominant position, like, if they say about that person that they're like the lowest scum of the earth, well, they've got a problem because they had that position themselves not that long ago, right? But you're right. I mean, times change. What society deems appropriate, right, good, acceptable changes. So sure. But sometimes I think politicians could be a little more forthright about what they do. That's my only point. Yeah, they call it a flip-flop. A flip-flop. Ashley, you want to keep going?
Sure. But that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the
Wait,
change.
let's just put it. His memory was not satisfactory, under control. So has anyone's, I don't want to get too political but the point is here, Winston doesn't simply accept what he's being told in the moment. There are many people kind of like sheeple who, whatever the thing is in the moment, however contradictory it was to the position they had 5 seconds before, they just go, this is what it is now. I was anti-war. I was the biggest anti-war person. I had peace symbols all over my bedroom or something. And now I'm all for war in Ukraine because this is the right war. Even though I was against all wars before, this one's now, whatever it is. We don't have to get, with these controversial examples. But the thing is with him, he doesn't just accept the propaganda because he has, he has his own mind, right? And the problem with him, this is a problem for him in this regime because he thinks for himself and realizes that what he was told yesterday is not what he was told today. And from his point of view, that's a problem because it's a contradiction. And he's rational in that way. I'm sorry. Keep going, Ashley.
Okay. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Therefore, Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil. And it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. The frightening thing.
So here's one more thing. Here's what it is. It's not just that things changed. It's that the regime doesn't acknowledge that there was a change to begin with. That's the catch. And that's kind of what a lot of politicians do. Okay.
Okay. Officially the change, where did I end off? Impossible? Oh, the frightening thing, he reflected for the 10,000th time as he forced his shoulders painfully backwards. With hands on hips, they were grating their bodies from the waist, an exercise that was supposed to be good for the back muscles. The frightening thing was that it might all be true. If the party could thrust its hands into the past and say, of this or that event, it never happened, that surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years. Ago. But where did the knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must be soon annihilated.
Destroyed.
Okay, annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past? Ran the party slogan. Controls the future. Who controls the present? Controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature unalterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite, all that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. In Newspeak, doublethink. Stand easy, barked the instructress a little more gently. Winston sank his arms to his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. His mind slid away into the labyrinth world of doublethink, to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness, while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out. Opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them. To use logic against logic, to
repudiate
I can't read.
Morality
While laying claim to it. To believe democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy. to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then probably promptly to forget it again, and above all, to apply the same process to the process.
Oh.
Itself, that was the ultimate sublead. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word double think involved the use of double think.
Okay, so what is double think? It's expressed in these contradictory expressions, freedom is slavery, war is peace, and so on and so on. And so he, in the previous paragraphs, he said something like, on one hand, history has never changed. On the other hand, it's constantly changing. Can anyone unpack that and explain how that could be the case, that on one hand, history had never changed, but on the other hand, it's constantly changing? This quintessential example of doublethink, where you simultaneously hold two ideas or beliefs that are directly contrary to one another. Let's put it this way. Why is it that history, first of all, there's a question about what we mean by history, but why is it that history never changes? In what way is that true?
It could be because it repeats itself.
Well, let's think about history this way. History is stuff that happened in the past. Why does it never change?
Because it's already happened.
And what? It happened one way and one way only. And what actually happened can't ever be changed, right? Right? The problem is there's two meanings of history that are intimately related and they're confused with one another. On one hand, history is what actually happened, and it only happens one way, and it can never change no matter what happens. And it's, as he says, it's everlasting. On the other hand, history is also a look into the past to understand what happened. And one of the problems is, while only one thing could have ever happened, we don't have perfect access to that one thing that happened. So every generation is constantly looking into the past and, either seeing slightly different facts or viewing those facts from a slightly different perspective. And obviously in the regime of 1984, it's even more than that. They're actively altering events to suit their needs. And they seem to control all totems, all symbols, all tokens of history by which we could understand the past. How do we know there was a past? I mean, we only are even aware that there is a past or what it is by the things that exist in the present that are emblems of things that have happened in the past. If you remove those things, what are the markers in your society by which you grasp what has happened, right? There are repositories of memory, whether they're books and texts, or whether they're statues, or whether they're buildings, or whether they're people who are older. You strip those away and you strip away what happened. It's quite terrifying, actually. Okay, let's go forward a little bit. He really gets into the weeds of what he does at the Ministry of Truth that I asked about at the beginning. And so we get a real clear understanding of what the implications of what he does here. Could I have another volunteer read for us? Yalen or Rukeya or Alia or Kenya?
Yes,
I'll
Professor,
read.
I can. Oh, sorry.
Rukeya, go for it.
Okay.
Alia, you can go next.
Okay.
Okay, so just to make sure, from where?
As soon as Winston.
Okay. So as soon as Winston had dealt with each of the messages, he clipped his speak written correction to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the pneumatic tube.
Okay,
Then
okay, let's just pause. So he's working at the Ministry of Truth right now at his desk, right? And he's taking these papers and he's getting new things in, like he does all this cut and pasting basically, right? We would do this all with our computer, but he does it the old fashioned way. And he has these tubes, pneumatic, it's just an air tube. It like shoots a little capsule and he opens it up and gets out. And then he's got the other thing that's the memory hole, which is like another tube that flushes the old facts down to be, you know, evaporated and annihilated, as he says. And of course, the
the
Times is the main paper, the Times of London, just like we have the New York Times. Go for it. I'm sorry.
okay, then with a movement which was as nearly as possible unconscious, he crumped up the original message and any notes that he himself had made and dropped them into the memory hole to be devoured by the flames. What happened in the unseen labyrinth to which the pneumatic tubes led, he did not know in detail, but he did know in general terms. As soon as all the correction which happened to be necessary in any particular number of the times had been assembled and collated, that number would be reprinted, the original copy destroyed, and the corrected copy placed on the files in its state.
Okay, so you can see what he does. He takes a paper from previous days, not necessarily the current day's paper, and revises it, and then they reprint it with the revision. And then the original paper that itself may have been a bunch of lies too, but you won't even know what those lies were. It gets sent down the memory hole to be destroyed. So there's no, the records of the past are really not from the past. They're always from the present because they're constantly being revised in the present as needed. You keep going?
Yeah. This process of continuous alteration was applied not only to the newspapers, but to books, periodicals, pamphlets, posters, leaflets.
All media, let's put it that way.
All media, films, soundtracks, cartoons, photographs, to every kind of literature or documentation which might conceivably hold any political or ideological significance. Day by day and almost minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. In this way, every prediction made by the party could be shown by documentary evidence to have been correct. Nor
Okay,
was any.
so I mean, this is a hilarious thing. So they made a prediction about some event or say the economy in a newspaper from a week ago, right? And then for whatever reason, the prediction didn't turn out to be perfectly true. So what do? They just go back in the paper from a week ago and make the prediction accurate based on what actually happened. So that the party becomes infallible, among other things, it becomes infallible, always correct, never wrong, right?
Nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. All history was palimpsest, scrapped clean, and reinscribed exactly as often as was necessary. In no case.
Let me just pause. All history was palimpsest, right? Palimpsest, it's basically like a writing surface that you write on it. Well, what do we talk about? Wiping the slate clean or a blank slate, things like that. Palimpsest is like a writing surface. You write on it, the past, and then you scrape it down completely. You basically erase it, and then you rewrite it, right? So this is just to capture in a kind of epigrammatic form what he's doing with all the media that comes before him.
In no case would it have been possible, once the deed was done, to prove that any falsification had taken place. The largest section of the records department, far larger than the one on which Winston worked, consisted simply on persons whose duty it was to track down and collect all copies of books, newspapers, and other documents which had been superseded, right? Superseded and were due for the destruction. A number of the times which might, because of changes in political alignment or mistaken prophecies uttered by Big Brother, have been rewritten a dozen times, still stood on the files bearing its original date, and no other copy existed to contradict it. Books also were recalled and rewritten again and again, and were invariably reissued without any admission that any alteration had been made. Even the written instruction which Winston received and which he invariably got rid of as soon as he had dealt with them, never stated or implied that an act of forgery was to be committed. Always the reference was to slaves, errors, misprints, or misquotations, which it was necessary to put right in the interest of accuracy. But actually, he thought as he readjusted the Ministry of Plenty's fingers, it was not even forgery. It was merely the substitution of one piece of nonsense for another. Most of the material that you are dealing with had no connection with anything in the real world.
Okay,
Not
let's
even-
pause there. It says most of what you were replacing itself had no connection with the real world. What is the truth? The truth as words that connect. I mean, if we're talking about truth as speech, truth as words that connect with the real world. They represent, they reflect some state, actual state, physical state of the world, reality, right? He's saying that not only am I making new lies, I'm making new lies for old lies here.
Not even the kind of connection that is contained in a direct lie. Statistics were just as much a fantasy in their original version as in their rectified version. A great deal of the time you are expected to make them up out of your head. For example, the Ministry of Plenty's forecast had estimated the output of boots for the quarter at 145 million pairs. The actual output was given as 62 millions. Winston, however, in rewriting the forecast, marked the figure down to 57 millions, so as to allow for the usual claim that the quota had been overfulfilled. In any case, 62 millions was no nearer the truth than 57 millions, or than 145 millions. Very likely no boots had been produced at all. Likelier still, nobody knew how many had been produced, much less cared. All one knew was that every quarter astronomical numbers of boots were produced on paper, while perhaps half the population of Oceania went barefoot. And so it was with every class of recorded fact, great or small. Everything faded away into a shadow world in which, finally, even the date of the year had become uncertain.
Okay,
Winston-
great. That's awesome. Can anyone think of examples in our own media or what have you that feels like this? I mean, I don't know what you follow or what you pay attention to or how much.
like the true amount, like the number of dead in COVID, like the true amount of dead.
Oh
and
my goodness, that's a really great example. How many had this? How many died? How many? Those numbers went up and down. I mean, actually, like the votes on the election night. Did you ever know votes could be taken away in the middle of election? How many people saw that on CNN where the numbers actually?
I saw that.
And the numbers went down in one column, and the same number that they went down in one column ended up going up in the other. That was the most, you know what? I'll tell you, 10 years ago, I'd never imagined that could ever happen on the face of the earth. And I saw it, and I saw people have videos of it. Yeah, that's really good. Alia.
I feel like a good example is also in music in current day and age, because it seems like sometimes when certain American artists try to come with a positive message for society or like to make a political change, they often somehow mysteriously die or get arrested.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Like which one? Tupac?
There was one more recently called Nipsey Hussle.
Oh, I remember the name. I don't remember too much about him, but I'm aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that one of him.
I mean, here's an interesting one. Everybody has some general idea, talk about propaganda, some general idea of Ghislaine Maxwell and kind of who she is.
Yes.
Yeah, so she was this, you know, it seems pretty darn diabolical person working with Jeffrey Epstein. You know, not just a friend of Jeffrey Epstein or a girlfriend, but a coworker, and she may have even been his boss, more like it. And they were trafficking human beings. They've only talked about young teenage girls in these trials, but I think the likelihood is, and it's just my speculation, that that probably goes much younger than that, and like shocking. And the people involved, I mean, does anyone know who went to Jeffrey Epstein's island? My God, the flight logs have been out there for over a decade. All these famous people. What's his name? Who's the guy from South Africa who filled in for Jon Stewart? I can't remember his name.
Trevor Noah?
You remember Jon Stewart had his own political show, and then
Trevor Noah? That's the one?
what's that?
Trevor Noah?
Yeah, Trevor Noah. I'm sorry, I couldn't. Yeah, so Trevor Noah did the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is a roast of the president, and they have a comedian come on and tell political jokes. And he made a joke, just like, oh, who's the British actor who did it during the Emmy Awards, who was in the British version of The Office? His name is on the tip of my tongue. But they both, here Trevor Noah is with the president off to his right and politicians and powerful people in the audience. And he makes a joke about how they've all been to Epstein Island, right? Like, is that a joke? If you look at the flight logs, you'll know whether it's a joke or not. Anyway, Ghislaine Maxwell, she had a trial so many months ago. She was convicted, thank God. But her trial got almost no coverage whatsoever. It was just like almost, I mean, it was mentioned in the media. I'm not going to say they didn't say anything, but they kept a lid on that like you wouldn't believe. Of course, there was a big expose a couple of years ago that an ABC journalist had done all this firsthand digging on Jeffrey Epstein, and she had put together like a whole segment, you know, a journalist segment exposing things about him. And ABC said, sorry, you are never putting that on our network, right? And of course, the networks were like the Me Too people talking about, you know, the victimhood of women. And yet, well, they had people like Matt Lauer to do some just gross stuff. Charlie Rose lost his job because of gross sexual misconduct he had. All these same people who were promoting Me Too, they were the perpetrators. And then another network promoting, you know, Me Too, which in itself is a good, I mean, my God, society should help victims of awful crimes, no doubt. But it turned out that they spiked this story on Jeffrey Epstein and refused to present it. And if you really want to speak truth to power like they claim to do, you don't spike a story like that. So anyway, the Ghislaine Maxwell story has been completely kind of shoved under the rug. And at the same time, you get wall-to-wall coverage of Johnny Depp talking about drinking and boozing it up and taking magic mushrooms and how he got hit by his wife and how his wife's are, you know, I mean, oh my God, they have played this. And I don't, you know, I've watched a few minutes of the Johnny Depp trial. It's certainly fascinating. And he was kind of up and coming when I was a kid. So there's like generationally, he's like on my radar. But But the thing is, as interesting as his trial may be, in one sense, it's just not news at all. It's not a serious story that really affects our country or what's going on in it. I mean, Ghislaine Maxwell, the people who they served, so to speak, were the political class, the elites, the corporate elites, the global elites. Yeah. It's kind of terrifying. Any other examples we can think of? I mean, the change in the COVID numbers, that was really stunning. And the change in the votes, which happened in 2 elections. Now, I think it happened in 2018 and it happened in 2020. And if you were confused, I mean, you should really think about, Ashley, you should think about what really happened there and how that can happen. And especially, here's the same thing, just like Orwell describes. Those numbers changed, but they never explained it. They didn't want you to believe that there ever was a change. See, what's the problem with this world? It's not just that they change things, is that they pretend like nothing has changed, right? The COVID numbers, I mean, the CDC would just go onto their website and change them. And then people would put up the old number and the new number. Or even better, they changed over the last 3 or 4 years, they changed the definition of vaccine 2 times to fit this drug that they've been giving us, these mRNA shots, which technically speaking, I mean, if you question them, you're anti-vax and you're anti-science and science denier and you should burn at the stake and all this stuff. I mean, it's stuff silly, right? Actually, the actual, what is it, kind of scientific definition of what a vaccine is and how they're made. I mean, the mRNA vaccine technically is not a vaccine in the traditional sense that, you know, the world has known about vaccines since for 100 years when that kind of medical technology was developed. And the idea that you could take like a deteriorated virus and get someone sick and it would actually give them immunity, that's actually a concept that people have known for hundreds of years. But the idea of actually injecting it into people and then building up immunity was sometime in the early 20th century. So that for their drug to fit vaccine, instead of making a real vaccine, they just changed the definition of the word vaccine to fit the drug. It was very interesting. Okay, so what I want to do now is to move forward to Newspeak. And here he's talking with his colleague in the Ministry of Truth, basically about what Newspeak is, right? And I mean, one thing interesting about it is it's new, right? Which has connotation of the news. It's the thing that's always current, right? And they're constantly updating it for it to be as current as possible. And Newspeak is really just an extension of this whole relationship with the past, of controlling it in order to control people in the present and shape them and direct them toward the future. Because now we're not dealing with historical events, but we're dealing with concepts, ideas, and the words that manifest them. And if you think about it, language in many ways is no different than all those statues and all those, the architecture of the past, the primary sources of the past. Language is a historical product. Why is English or why is French, why is Spanish the way it is today? Well, if you wanted to understand the identity of the language today, just like yourself, you'd have to go look into the past and see how it developed over time and how those words came to mean what they mean. And one of the things about words is their meaning is connected with their context of use. The meaning is connected with the history. So there are certain terms that develop in certain historical periods based on certain realities or political realities, social realities, whatever it happens to be, right? So here, by controlling the language, you're still involved with controlling the past and reshaping it. But here it's much more insidious because it's not just statements about the past, it's the language itself and the words and concepts you have available to you to even describe the world you're living in to yourself. Okay. Alia, do you want to read for us? 912, oh crap.
Yeah, sure. The 11th edition is the definitive edition. He said, we're getting the language into its final shape. The shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. When we finish with it, people like you will have to learn it all over again. You think I dare say that our chief job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them, every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. The 11th edition won't contain a single word that will become obsolete before the year 2050.
Okay, so we're destroying the words. So destroying the words here is actually just the same as destroying the past, because those words have come to us from the past and their meanings are tied not just to other words, but they're tied to things that have happened in the past, right? That's really crucial. And let's come back to a more basic point about techniques of slavery. Boy, if schools had a class on slavery, and I don't just mean like as a historical institution, and I certainly don't just mean the slavery in America, because it was a universal institution going back to the beginnings of civilization. If we had a class that explained the techniques that are used to enslave people, I think we'd all liberate ourselves. One of the biggest, and Alia, just come to you, just have a second. One of the biggest techniques that the slave master, and here this party, the party is the slave master here. Don't be fooled, right? One of the biggest techniques they use is keeping the slave in ignorance. And if you haven't, you should all read Frederick Douglass's autobiography. He was much more than a slave, but he was born into slavery and he liberated himself from it, both physically, but also psychologically and intellectually. And one of his most powerful stories by far is the story of learning how to read, especially when the slave master realized that his wife was teaching young Frederick Douglass at like 6 years old how to read. And he realized what a threat this represented, because the slave will get ideas. The slave will be liberated from its state of ignorance and become aware. One of the things he claims not to have been aware of is just actually what it was to be a slave. He didn't realize how unfree he was until he got exposed to the world, in part through books, and he realized what was wrong with his condition. Imagine someone being so habituated to their slavery that they don't fully grasp what's wrong with it to begin with. That's kind of the ultimate in controlling a slave. Alia, what's up?
I had the idea from my Roman class that back then in like the Roman times that they were totally against Commonwealth people acquiring the same knowledge as them, being able to articulate themselves or be anything aside from really, like you said, ignorant, because they didn't want to deal with people overthrowing them. Like if they have the same knowledge as them, then it makes no point. But that's another thing that
and the truism that we all know, and it's really true, knowledge is power, right? So if you want to keep the people down, you can't let them have the power, you can't let them have the knowledge.
But the sad part too is that I have a Dominican and Haitian border class where I saw that recently still in Haiti that they are living in extreme poverty and slavery. And there was a documentary that we were watching, and it's like the people who were enslaved in Haiti, they don't even really understand the amount of wrong that's going on with them, because they have to, yeah.
One of the greatest techniques in slavery is to keep the slave in the dark about their own enslavement. And let me tell you that throughout history, ruling elites of all kinds have devised really incredibly sophisticated ways of keeping people in their place, keeping them down without them being aware of what's going on to them. To the point where you say, it's nice. Think of the Matrix, right? Who is really woke or awake to be aware that they're even in this virtual reality that enslaves them? Most people aren't even aware of it. And then some of the few who are, there's that one character, I think it's played by guy Joe Pantoliano or something. And he's aware that he's living in the Matrix, in this virtual world, which is a lie. Like, you know, human beings basically want to live in light of the truth, not a big lie. But then he's eating his imaginary steak and drinking his imaginary wine. And he goes, I know it's not a real steak. I know it's not a real glass of wine, but it tastes good, right? So he's like acquiesced to his condition. But the ultimate form of slavery is when people aren't fully cognizant of what's going on. And this issue of keeping the masses, you know, uneducated, either altogether or about certain things. I mean, if you learn about like ancient Egypt, that was a classic. Like the only people who were permitted by law to read and write were like the elite courtiers and the scribes and things like that. And knowledge was very self-consciously concealed from the ordinary person. And one of the easy ways to do that is like, if they can't read and write, well, there's a lot of knowledge they can't have access to. But slavery is also a matter of degree. I mean, not all slavery is extreme as like, you know, chattel slavery where people are in chains and they're like breaking rocks or picking cotton or what have you. There are much more subtle forms. And slavery is not just a political or physical condition, it's also a psychological condition. Ali, you want to keep going? Oh, we're getting off track here.
Sure. He bit hungrily into his bread and swallowed a couple of mouthfuls, then continued speaking with a sort of pedant's passion. His thin, dark face had become animated. His eyes had lost their mocking expression and grown almost dreamy. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words, of course. The great wastage is in the verbs and adjectives, but there are hundreds of nouns that can be got rid of as well. It isn't only the synonyms, there are also the antonyms. After all, what justification is there for a word which is simply the opposite of some other word? A word contains its opposite in itself. Take good, for instance. If you have a word like good, what need is there for a word like bad? Ungood will do just as well, better, because it's an exact opposite, which the other is not. Or again, if you want a stronger version of good, what sense is there in having a whole string of vague, useless words like excellent and splendid and all the rest of them? Plus good covers the meaning, or double plus good if you want something stronger still. Of course, we would use those forms already, but in the final version of Newspeak, there will be nothing else. In the end, the whole notion of goodness and badness will be covered by only 6 words. In reality, only 1 word. Don't you see the beauty of that, Winston? It was BB's idea originally, of course. He added as an afterthought.
So let's ask a question. So this guy is like totally brainwashed and he's totally bought into the system. He's like an NPC player with no thought of his own. It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words. Well, we've spent a lot of this class talking about how human identity is really beyond, once you get beyond the biological, it's really rooted in language and our ability to conceive and think and speak in words, right? So the destruction of words is a destruction of human identity here and its richness. You remove all these words and you remove our ability to experience things, right? You know, psychologists and cognitive scientists and all this, they've kind of discovered something interesting about our experiences. Obviously, a lot of our experiences are physical and sensory, like, you know, the physical feel of things. But the issue is that our physical experience of things is also tethered to how we conceive of what we're experiencing. And our conceptual framing of what we experience can't be completely separated from the physical feeling. They're intermingled together, right? And words give us concepts that allow us to experience things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to experience. Let's be obvious. Pausanias talks about heavenly love. It's this like cerebral, high-minded, cultural love, something more than just sex that other animals perform. And therefore, you know, other animals can't understand this high-minded, you might call it platonic love, that is above simply love of bodies, right? It's something spiritual, right? Well, without language, you can't have that type of love. It can't exist because it's supported by language. So with the destruction of words here, it's kind of devastating what it's going to do to human identity and human experience. It's going to turn us into like little mindless cogs. The other thing is, this is a really interesting example, good and bad. They're opposites, right? They're antonyms. And so why do we need two words to describe two sides of the same coin? We just need good and ungood. Well, is the word bad a perfect opposite of the word good? Does bad simply capture the opposite of good?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, are there other shades of meaning that can be given to the word bad that don't explicitly relate to it being the opposite of good?
I mean, yeah, bad can mean something
Yes.
than just wrong. So,
I
yeah.
mean, there's a whole bunch of words that could be used as the opposite of good, beside just bad, right? There can be good and evil, and there can be good and bad, right? And when we say good and good versus bad versus good versus evil, we're not talking about exactly the same thing. And so the interesting thing here is that, yes, these words are opposites in their general meaning, but if you really look at all the shades of meaning of the word bad, it's more than just not good. It has other associations and connotations to it. So by stripping away that word, you're stripping away all these potential meanings that we might find in the world around us, right? And of course, this character is like, he's a full-blown, you know, he's ingested the ideological crack of the regime, right? I mean, he's like high on it. He loves it. Let's keep going a little more, Alia. And we'll finish up with this discussion here.
Sorry. A sort of vapid eagerness fitted across Winston's face at the mention of Big Brother. Nevertheless, Syme immediately detected a certain lack of enthusiasm. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, Syme or Simi.
Okay.
You pronounce it the way you want.
You haven't a real appreciation of newspeak, Winston, he said almost sadly. Even when you write it, you're still thinking in old speak. I've read some of those pieces that you write in the Times occasionally.
Okay, let's just pause for a second. We are getting a pretty clear idea of what newspeak is. This reduced language. We could just call it dumbed down and reduced and politically correct. It's a language that conforms with INGSOC, English socialism, which is the only accepted ideology and is perpetuated by the party, in part through the language. We know what newspeak is. Actually, what is old speak? It's old. Yeah, we don't like old things. What is old speak?
It was when they used to be able to have more freedom, have their own thoughts, have their own opinions.
I agree. What would we call old speak in one word?
Freedom.
It certainly has the freedom to it that newspeak doesn't. What is old speak? Maybe more than one word you need. What is old speak?
I find there to be old speak in our real world.
It's like old school rap. What is old speak?
Old speak to me is before Blackberry phones when.
Okay, yeah. So we even have our own form of newspeak with like texting and
Mhm.
political correctness or any variety of things that absolutely sure. And you know, every society has this to a degree, and we fight to maintain, you know, the traditions of the language in the face of all kinds of changes that alter language. Language is constantly in flux. This is one important observation that is not just true of 1984, it's true of language in general. I'm sorry, I gotta cut to the chase here. Do we all speak newspeak or old speak? Us people in class here.
We speak old speak, but we
Yeah.
live new speak.
Yeah, let's leave it right there. We speak old speak. What is old speak? It's just plain English. It's English.
But English I've been learned in the past.
Well, I mean, to say English that was learned in the past is not that long ago, right? Your English is where your English, Luis, doesn't come from the future. I mean, it comes from the present, but where does the present come from? It comes from the past, right? So old speak is just English. Now he's gonna clarify a little of the history of old speak so you get a sense of what he's talking about. But let's face it, he's talking about the rich language of English, happens to be English in this case because, you know, we're reading in English, but and of course, you know, nations in their identity are deeply tied to their language and their linguistic traditions because their identity is manifest in part through their language, right? So you change a language and you change a people. Think about all the things we're doing with words. We're trying to rewrite reality all the time. There was a law passed out in Washington State that the word marijuana was a racist term and it had to be replaced in all state language by cannabis. Now, I'm sure they provided some explanation as to why marijuana was a racist word, but can I be honest? Have any of you ever associated marijuana as having some kind of racial connotation? The word?
No.
I mean, shit. The one thing I know about marijuana is like it's universally embraced by all races. I mean, if we're talking about race at all and weed, right? Like, so, I mean, they have some explanation, but, and maybe their explanation in a very narrow context has some kind of resonance, but I actually think what they're doing by wanting to get rid of the word marijuana is that marijuana is more associated with the drug use. And it's associated with the tradition, I don't want to say the tradition, but the history of like, you know, taking drugs, and it's a gateway drug and all these things. But when you use the word cannabis, that's like the scientific name, cannabis sativa and all that stuff. And one of the big things that's happening in this country right now is the commercialization of weed as it gets decriminalized. So my suspicion is that they don't really care about the racial aspect of this, but what they care about is getting rid of the word that has connotations of criminal conduct and replacing it with a scientific word. So then, you know, it will help encourage people to get involved in the commercial element of marijuana, because simply for one reason and one reason only, the moolah, because it's going to be a very lucrative industry once it looks like the federal law is going to change and it's going to be legalized. And all these politicians for years who said, oh, this is a gateway drug, it's really bad for your kids. All of a sudden they've got dollar signs in their eyeballs, and all of a sudden they've forgotten about all their moral qualms about it, and they're ready to cash in if it gets legalized. Alia, what's up?
One thing I also noticed that had happened kind of similar to that is that they had changed. Do you know Aunt Jemima pancakes?
Of course I do.
They changed the picture on the box. There's no longer like the black lady. The name is no longer Aunt Jemima. It's now called Pearl Milling Company. And
They
then
changed it. They changed it twice. When I was growing up, she had a little like a headscarf. And then they changed it to like a kind of curly hair, almost like a perm or something.
yeah, but now it's nothing at
And
all.
now
She
she's
doesn't-
gone altogether.
yeah.
And Lando Lake's Butter had the Indian girl sitting there, Indian style. She disappeared too. The
They took her off.
Redskins disappeared too. Now you can think of it two ways. You can think of like, this is the politically correct, we're purifying society of these images that are bearers of negative
Professor.
stereotypes. Or you could say what you're really doing is eliminating the historical facts.
But not eliminating the racism that has it in the picture.
Pardon?
The race, like it being raised to other people. The picture.
Yeah, that's what they
And
said.
like-
Sorry, Lewis.
Like the picture is racist to other people. Like people take it as they're being race. That's why they removed the picture from that label.
Oh, I understand perfectly well the logic, but the explanation behind why they did it. Does anyone know how many indigenous Native Americans were offended by the Redskins name on the football team? Like what percentage were actually offended by it?
I thought it was a lot. That's why it was changed.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I'm not actually sure that they were particularly. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't images out there that are offensive. Not at all, because there obviously are. But I mean, the little bit I'm just speaking off the cuff. The little bit I looked at it, Native Americans were not particular. I mean, look, there's all these sports teams that actually recognize, and most of them, of course, they're stereotypes because you can't not have stereotypes when you're dealing with these kinds of things. But most of the stereotypes with the sports teams are positive images. I mean, they may be old fashioned of, say, Native Americans, but the Braves, things like that. I mean, maybe it's a white perspective celebration of them rather than them representing themselves. And that could in itself be a problem. But then you can ask another question, and it's a question for another time because we're running out of time here and I want to finish this paragraph. Okay, you've eliminated the image. Tell me what problem you've solved. Did taking Aunt Jemima off the syrup solve inner city violence in Baltimore City or Chicago,
At all.
Detroit?
No, at all. No.
Yeah.
At all. It's
So
still
what
happening.
disturbs me is that there are certain inner cities that are not taking the appropriate measures to solve the problems that they talk about all the time. And instead they do these very superficial things that are very showy and propagandistic, but they don't get in the weeds of both addressing and being honest about the real challenges and the real problems that I think, most Americans don't want to see. Most Americans don't want to see inner city violence the way. Who's the victim of inner city violence? It's African Americans in many cases, not exclusively, but well, we could get into all kinds of political stuff about who runs those cities and why they claim to care so much, but what do they do? But we should stick with language here for the last 3 seconds. Alia, do you think you could just kind of finish this up and we'll ask a few more things and then call it quits?
It says, even when you write it, you're still thinking in old speak. I've read some of those pieces that you write in Times occasionally. They're good enough. But they're translations. In your heart, you prefer to stick to old speak with all its vagueness and its useless shades of meaning. You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year? Winston did know that, of course. He smiled sympathetically. He hoped, not trusting himself to speak. Syme bit off another fragment of the dark-colored bread, chewed it briefly, and went on. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be. Yeah.
Okay. How do you control people? You have thought crime to control them. But even better than that, you don't even allow them to think a thought contrary to what in this world is considered politically correct. That's the scary reality, right? Keep going.
Okay, in the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Already in the 11th edition, we're not far from that point, but the process will still be continuing long after you and I are dead. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Even now, of course, there's no reason or excuse for committing thought crime. It's merely a question of self-discipline, reality control. But in the end, there won't be any need for that. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect. Newspeak is inkstock and inkstock is Newspeak, he added with a sort of mystical satisfaction. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could understand such a conversation as we are having now? Except, began Winston doubtfully, and then stopped. It had been on the tip of his tongue to say, except the pros, but he checked himself, not feeling fully certain that this remark was not in some way unorthodox. Syme, however, had divined that what he was about to say. The pros are not human beings, he said carelessly. By 2050 earlier, probably all real knowledge of Old Speak will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, they'll exist only in Newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. Even the literature of the party will change. Even the slogans will change. How could you have a slogan like freedom is slavery when the concept of freedom has been abolished? The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness.
Okay, great. Awesome. Just a couple thoughts here. What is the word orthodox or orthodoxy mean?
Means like, no, that's kind of like a paradox.
Or orthogonal line. There's orthodonture, like when you get your teeth straightened.
Does it mean to be like generic, to be like stick with the status quo?
It's connected with that. Do you know what it literally means? There's two words here, ortho and dox or doxy. What those two, the prefix and the suffix actually mean.
It means, I guess, like to conform to like a tradition, to accept what's true.
Yeah. So, well, we could set aside what people believe is true as opposed to what's true. So,
But what you want to believe.
Yeah, an orthodoxy is a kind of traditional set of beliefs or a habituated set of beliefs that everybody accepts as true, right? Ortho means right, like correct. And doxy means, dox has to do with opinion or belief. It's actually Greek. Doxa means opinion. So it's literally everybody has to have the correct opinion. When everybody has the correct opinion in 1984, there will be no thought crime. How are they going to lead everybody to having the correct opinion? By Newspeak eliminating their ability to have any thought other than the correct opinion, right? He mentions some names. I want to finish with this. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron. He says they'll only exist in Newspeak versions. He says they'll no longer be anything like what they were. They'll be just like Newspeak versions of themselves, which is just like a reflection of everything else in the present. what are these names? Who are these people? And why are they there? Why are they mentioned?
Shakespeare is like
There's,
yeah.
Go for it, Elliot. All right, Luis.
Shakespeare is basically, it's a play that happens. It's a story, but play out in the play that tell you what happens.
Considered the greatest playwright in what language?
European.
Original English.
Very good. The greatest playwright of the English language.
No, first English language that was created.
We might call it old speak.
Like
right?
the first English that was created in the past.
Not quite. Chaucer is closer to that, but not quite. So all of these are English authors. And number one, they wrote in English, and different versions historically of English as it developed. I mean, ones we would recognize, but you would see differences. And they
different plays.
I'm sorry?
A different plays of the Shakespeare with a different English version of it.
Sure. And so let me mention that. I kind of want to wrap this up, and we all want to go home now. But so I mean, these are English authors, like as in they're from England, the country. But number two, they're all considered some of the greatest authors and writers in the English language. And it's not just that they wrote in the English language, they're given credit for inventing it, would be too strong a word, but almost inventing their own way of using the language and inventing words to give us a body of language that we have inherited, if we so choose to inherit it, because you have to read it to really inherit it. A body of words that allow us to really articulate the world in a rich and complex way, in a well, let's just say a deeply human way, right? Our language that we speak today is still influenced by these monumental figures of the English language. Not only that, they're historical, they're from the past. And one thing we haven't mentioned is the one thing the past does. I mean, on one hand, you want to know the past because your identity is the result of historical development from the past to the present. The other thing is the past is different from the present, right? Inevitably. What is history? It's about change, right? When you have these authors in their original forms, right? You are learning about a different world, a different mindset, a different mentality, a different way of thinking, a different set of beliefs, not the orthodoxy of today, and maybe not even the orthodoxy of then, but some other way of looking at the world, right? The last thing you want in society is a world in which everybody only views everything from the same perspective. The only way you get at the truth is by being open to considering multiple points of view about things and having those different points of view play out in the marketplace of ideas, right? I believe this. No, I believe that. No, I believe this. So what do those people do? They come together and they dispute. And in the point of, you may not end up agreeing with them, but they give you a different perspective from your own, and they're going to change the way you think about whatever it is. The last thing you want in society is only one position. I actually remember when the executive of Google, he said the only problem with Google is that when you search whatever topic it is you search, he said the problem is you don't get just one answer. And actually, of course, since Google and Facebook and Twitter are so involved in the censorship and propaganda, what did Google want? They didn't want diversity of points of view. That's what free speech manifests. That's why you have to have free speech, because it allows multiple conflicting points of view to come into the public sphere and have a voice, right? Nobody wants to shut down the point of view that everybody agrees with. Free speech is there for the point of view that a lot of people don't agree with. so it can have a say, and people are forced to confront it and argue with it. And maybe they have a better argument, but they have to make the argument. So these authors, not only are they the authors of some of the richness of the English language that we've inherited, us, not just people in books, but also the world that they speak of provides a different perspective on the world than simply the orthodoxies of the present, right? And one of the most important things as a human being is everybody seeks the truth. They want to know, and the only way you can really seek the truth is by getting exposed to points of view other than the accepted status quo beliefs of your own immediate society, right? You may come to agree with those beliefs, but you've done it after you've actually questioned them by seeing other points of view. And of course, what is Newspeak determined to do? To eliminate all these points of view by eliminating the language, by eliminating the history. It all is of a same piece. Okay. Questions, thoughts, comments about all this? Now everybody wants to pick up Shakespeare and start reading him, I can tell. You should pick up Shakespeare. How many people have read Shakespeare?
I read all Shakespeare, even, and I watched all the movies too, all of it.
What about Chaucer? Has anybody read Chaucer?
Not me.
I mean, let me say this about your own education and mine too. There was a day when, simply because English is the dominant language of American society, that you would have been by default taught an English lit class, not for some Eurocentric reason, white males have to dominate everything or anything like that, but simply because these are the progenitors of a tradition that you're now partaking in, speaking the English language. And it's to your advantage to be not ignorant, but informed about the history of the language that you use to speak. And obviously language is a melting pot. Like, everybody contributes to the development of language. And maybe we could leave it with this. You think of Junot Diaz, he uses a little bit of his kind of Spanglish in his short stories, like The Money, just a little bit there, to help capture his distinct experience as an immigrant, not just living in America, but also engaging with the English language, where he kind of seamlessly, what you do in with Spanglish, you go back and forth seamlessly between English and Spanish as if it's really one language instead of two. And in a sense, it is kind of one language, because English can, any language can introduce words from other language groups and just assimilate them and so on. So with that, I think we should call it quits, because we've gone over time here. And next class, we'll pick up with the intimate relationships, which are really fascinating and I think pretty interesting. So with that, everybody have a great night, and I will see you all next Wednesday.
Have a good night, Professor.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So I see there's 2 discussion board for week 14, I guess.
Yeah.
Do we have to do both?
Well, so there was one kind of like at the end of spring break, and then there was the following one for last Wednesday. Just do your catch up. You have to do them all. Just catch up on them by next week.
All right, thank you.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
I didn't see the discussion board for that week. I'm a little confused. I'm a little confused because I did all the discussion board, but the only one I'm missing is the one from the.
The bottom line is there are 3 discussion boards, and there are 3 links in the assignment for one for each discussion board.
Okay, I did the first week, but the other 2 weeks is not still due.
I don't know what you mean.
I'm trying to log in right now. I'm gonna explain to you right now. Back to Blackwood to tell you what I'm talking about. So discussion. So wait.
Hold on. Hold on. What section are you in? Do you remember?
Yeah, I'm in section A12.
Yep.
A12. So I have, but you skip, so you skip 10 and 12.
Hold on. Let me get. Hold on. I'll put it up
Okay.
here. Okay, so you go here,
Okay.
and these are the assignments right here with the date.
Yes. But May
So
4th, May 4th is today. That's the week from there. I did the first one. I did April 27th. But a week of spring break, you said me had an assignment. I didn't see no assignment for that day, for that week.
well, wait a second. So your assignment over the break was to do the reading.
Okay, to read it.
And then the actual reading response was due the 27th.
Okay, but I still read it. I still read the book no matter what.
Yeah.
I still read it, but I didn't know that was
I mean,
the assignment.
the only, well, I mean, just because it's due on the 27th doesn't mean you can't work. I mean, I don't know how many days a student spends. I don't know when you do it, but I mean, obviously you had the whole break to work on it, right? So, I mean, so this is why you were confused. Week 12 was the spring break, right?
Yes, correct.
So like, but the bottom line is week 12 and 13 kind of ran together because you could have started reading 1984 during spring break and done this assignment, and then it was actually due during week 13.
So, okay, now I get it. So you're telling me that week 13 counted as 2 weeks.
Yeah, basically, but you're getting too caught up in something that's not important because all that matters is this response due this day, this response due this day, this response due this day.
I do the discussion, but when it says it's due.
Yeah, that's all that matters.
And then on top of that, you don't have discussion 10. You skip discussion 10. You went from 9 to 11. Week 10, you skip week 10.
Okay, so maybe there's a minor little boo-boo with the week listing, but I might even be able to explain it, why that is, but I'm not going to do it right now. The point is, always follow, when you do the I mean, we're at the end of the semester now. I mean, did this affect anything that the number is off? The point is, all the homework assignment links are in the assignment folder from the beginning of the semester. And if it was confusing, that's my fault. I understand if you're confused, and if your confusion led to some problem doing the work, then that would be a problem. But if it's just a little bit confusion that resulted only in confusion, like, you know.
No, okay, now I get it. And just forget about the numbering of the week. Just do the assignment that's due for that week.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Okay, and then
that's why I said when you go to the discussion board, do it by going through the assignment folder and following the link.
Okay, now, okay, I'm good then. The only thing I have to do is this week. I'm catch up already. I'm already up to date. For me, it's not a problem then.
And do you want to know the answer? Do you want to know the answer why it goes from 9 to 11?
Yes.
Because I think we spent 2 weeks on book, you know, and another week on Aristotle, and the week 12. Week 10, there was no new assignment.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
So I got you.
Now I got it. But now I know you just go follow with the date and the folder, and then do the one that's
Yeah.
linked to that folder.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, great.
So there was a reason why there was, see, if I had put this week 10, well, it's not week 10. See, I go by like just the actual calendar, right? That's what makes the week.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, week 12 is combined with week 13.
Yeah, basically.
Perfect, great. At least I'm not missing no work. I'm up.
No, all right. If that's your concern, then you're correct.
Button.
No, that was my concern. I thought I was missing work because